The Amalgamated denounced Berkman. Even before the assassination attempt, the Union had thrown several anarchists out of town for agitating among the strikers. Still, the public held the people of Homestead responsible for the shooting. O'Donnell feared the worst.
It would seem that the bullet from Berkman's pistol, failing in its foul intent, went straight through the heart of the Homestead Strike.
The strikers were also facing a legal assault. The company had had warrants issued for McLucky, O'Donnell, and 5 other men, charging them with the murders of 2 Pinkerton guards during the battle on July 6th. McLucky, who had worked hard to keep Homestead sober, surrendered at the courthouse in a state of drunken bravado. He was locked up, and bail was set at $10,000, severely straining the Union's resources. By the end of October, 2,000 men were at work in the mill. 200 of them were former employees. In spite of continued support from across the nation, the unity of the forces at Homestead began to crumble. During the first week of November, many of the non-unionized mechanics deserted the Amalgamated. Winter was fast approaching, and a settlement seemed unlikely. Black workers, traditionally excluded from steelmaking at Homestead, were brought into the mill by company agents. Although they represented a small fraction of the non-union workforce, they were singled out for attack. Hundreds of townspeople vented their frustration in a vicious riot that ended with calls for lynching. On November 8th, Americans went to the polls and voted for the Democratic challenger Grover Cleveland. As the Republicans had feared, President Harrison and his high tariff policy were defeated. On November 18th, Sylvester Critchlow became the first Homestead man to go to trial. The jury deliberated for just 1 hour before returning its verdict. Not guilty. But the strikers' vindication came too late. While Critchlow sat on trial, 2,000 mechanics and laborers proposed that the Union call an end to the strike. At first, the Union men balked at the thought of giving in. But after 2 days of dispirited debate, many were convinced that holding out would be futile. By a narrow margin, they voted to end the strike.
All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed?
Strike declared off yesterday. Our victory is now complete and most gratifying.
Life worth living again. The first happy morning since July.
The following day, over 2,000 strikers lined up at the mill gate. Only 406 were rehired. The strike organizers were barred from working in the mill, and the company circulated a blacklist that kept them out of the industry nationwide. O'Donnell became a reporter and moved to Chicago. Alexander Berkman spent 14 years in prison before rejoining the anarchist movement. He and Emma Goldman were deported to Russia in 1919. McLucky remained a political organizer, but his work was sporadic and poorly paid. He eventually settled in Mexico and took a job on the Sonora Railway. By the close of 1892, the Amalgamated had lost its jurisdiction in all the Carnegie mills. A decade later, the Union had been driven from every major steel plant in the nation. Unionism in the steel industry had been crushed at Homestead. Before disbanding, the Homestead men issued this statement.
The most evident characteristic of our time and country is the control of each of our great national industries by one or a few men. It is a power which, though expressed as the right of employers to manage their business to suit themselves, is coming to mean nothing less than the right to manage the country to suit themselves.
In the year following the battle, 10 more states enacted laws banning the use of private armies. Businesses increasingly relied on state militias to quell their labor disputes. Long after his retirement, Frick continued to defend his role in the strike.
The demands of modern life called for such work as ours, and if we had not met the demands, others would have done so. Even without us, the steel industry of the country would have been just as great as it is, though men would have used other names in speaking of its leaders.
Homestead haunted Andrew Carnegie to the end of his days. He had built himself a reputation as a friend of the working man, but he could not wash his hands of the blood spilt on July 6th. He would return to Homestead in 1898 to present the town with a library. His employees, who worked 12-hour days, 7 days a week, found little time to use it.
On the flats, close to the water's edge, there were masses of great sheds out of which grim smokestacks rose with a desolate effect. Higher up, the tenement houses stood in dingy rows, alternating with vacant lots. The sidewalks were sunken, swaying, full of holes. Everywhere the yellow mud of the street lay kneaded into a sticky mass, through which the groups of pale, lean men slouched in faded garments, grimy with the soot and grease of the mills.
This description of Homestead appeared less than 2 years after the strike. Another 4 decades would pass before the creation of industrial unions would substantially improve the lives of Homestead's workers.
But oh, it was awful that day at the homestead, when the river ran red on its way to the sea, when brave men were falling and women were weeping, and riot was king of the land of the free.